Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today. About a year ago on the channel in the spring of 2023, we did an exploration called Designs of the Old World, where we looked into the particular designs of these rather erratic French architects, Lequeux, pictured here, and Boully. We don't really have a picture of Boully, but here's a very intriguing picture of Lequeux. Looks like he could be portrayed by Thomas Hulse in a movie, and looks quite similar to what we saw of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in the eponymous film, Amadeus. Regardless, the works of these particular architects are quite intriguing. We're told that these French architects, draughtsmen, or all the other different names that we have for individuals who design buildings, because we need to have many different names for them, are considered very eccentric and elaborate. And indeed, this particular sphere here shows us a rather unique architectural format. Now, of course, we're told that these were merely the buildings that existed in the imaginations or the conceptualizations of these French architects. And I suggested about a year ago that, in fact, these were actually recordings of buildings that may have existed. Now, what's the evidence behind this? I figured we'd go back and we'd actually take a look that this is actually a full archive of the structures that may have remained from the previous civilization. In the drawings that are attributed to Lequeux, we see a great precision in detailing. And if you want to go back and watch the video from last year, I'll attach it in the description for this video. But in these images that we're reviewing, you can see that he left no detail spared when he was considering the layout for these buildings. For example, look at the top of this particular structure, and we see this ornamental detailing at the top. Is that just from his elaborate imagination? What exactly is with this very tall needle spire here on this part of the structure? It's really unique, and oftentimes it gives the impression that really what we have is simply a recording, that what they were doing is that they were recording what they saw, that this wasn't some elaborate imagination. Now here's where it gets more interesting, is when you look at some of his other structures, look at the interior behind this one. What exactly is this? This appears to be under rock. And we think about all the theories that we have concerning melted buildings. And indeed, we have seen these phenomena before. Whether you're looking at the coke kiln ovens in Utah that John Levi has so wonderfully explored, or many other structures. So why would someone lay out a structure like this in a conceptualized design that was displaying this? Unless what they were really looking at was the remnants of a structure that had survived a reset from the previous civilization, and they were recording it before it was going to be demolished, salvaged, certainly not repurposed for use. Look at this very intricate, this looks to be like a fountain, but who knows exactly what this is for sure. Perhaps this is some sort of advanced power generation device or some form of technology we can't understand. Now, I'm well aware we're going to be derided for even considering this, but I'm not hesitating now. And given the fact that the channel's been going for a year, I think we've shown many examples in on-site explorations where we see architecture like this and a different purpose. And it seems that our friends Lequeux and Boully were the perfect individuals who could record this. Now, you might recall this very interesting interior that we have for this particular structure. What exactly is this? Well, this came up a couple different times as some sort of crystal power generation technology. What exactly was going on with this fire? Is this some sort of generator, or is this something else entirely? Interestingly enough is that these drawings are so detailed, these works of art, that they really do come off as being actual recordings, cross-section recordings. And indeed, this is the kind of detail that we'd expect to see in many of the structures that we've explored on the ground, and yet for whatever reason, the plans, the schematics just aren't available, or if they are, they're in a single perspective. And yet when we look at these works, for example here, what's going on here? Is this actually a cave exploration, or is this again a recording of something that remained from a previous civilization? You notice the focus on what appears to be a monument or a memorial, or at least that's what we think of it as. And yet underground here in this cave, we have this very elaborate statue, this fountain, that seems to be depicting something that we would not consider modest, since we're told that the mores of society, when these schematics, these concepts were drawn, were a little different than what they are now. So it's something that really defies what we're told about history and the narrative. And we do see that from both Lequeux and Boully, very elaborate designs. Incredible fountains, multi-layer structures, and very unique architectural stylings. And yet at the same time, while we're told that this is some sort of elaborate and eccentric conceptualization, we've seen examples of these in every city in the Midwest of the United States, in many cities in Europe, and in Asia and everywhere else that we've explored. We've seen examples of this fine detailed architecture. Even the size of the interior of the structure, which is featured on the thumbnail for this exploration, look at the size of these columns and their height. Now remember, we have that Grand Avenue water tower in St. Louis, and remember how tall that column was. Now imagine what kind of structure you could really achieve if you had this many columns. Again, this is something that was considered eccentric, and this is supposedly attributed to Beaulieu, but I don't think it really matters who it's attributed to. Look at the gargantuan and colossal interior of this particular structure. What exactly is going on here? Again, is this something they're recording, or is this some sort of event that was occurring in the structure before it was brought down? It's very detailed, and indeed you can see how far the columns go. One could think that this would invigorate the imaginations, or perhaps what this was a recording of a structure that existed, and it's now found its way into other what we would consider fantasy drawings, and indeed it's now affiliated with fantasy, and there's a very defined reason for that. And yet in these other structures, we've seen similar layouts in many of the large Union stations that we've looked at, where it seems as though we're looking at a hangar of some sort. What would really be the purpose for laying out a building like this with all these columns lining the walls? And we're to believe that looking at the image, this is a library, and yet this seems to be a massive hangar. We've seen these indentations and impressions before on other structures. What's with the opening at the top? Well, it's to provide lighting so that they could read during the day because they didn't have electricity at that time. That seems rather comical now. And yet, this would be a very interesting repurposing of this building if it still stood and they were attempting to salvage all the books that they had. But what was its original intention and purpose? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. And yet, Beaulieu had other designs attributed to him. For example, we see the classic pyramid design here, very, very advanced looking with some obelisks flanking it on either side. And yet, when you look at the structure, you can see that this is smaller blocks, and yet there's a fine pattern detailing within this. Now, think about the effort that went into this sketch as well. What kind of effort did someone put into sketching this? And just zoom in a little bit here so you can actually see the size of individuals, people, for scaling. Although, of course, that's not always reliable because who knows exactly how tall these people depicted in this image are. Now, once again, this will be derided, but if you look in other aspects of this image, you can see that there's more obelisks on the other side of this pyramid structure. So again, is this something that survived the reset from a previous civilization? There seems to be some definitive evidence for that. And we also have Beaulieu's other drawings where it's not just pyramids, but we also have spheres, the same spheres that were depicted by Lequeux, supposedly, that depict a completely different kind of architectural styling. And yet, once again, for some reason, these particular sketches, these drawings, this elaborate imagination of Beaulieu, here where we're mixing a sphere with a pyramid or cone structure, somehow this has survived to reach us. Now, is it really just so simple to say that this is the wild imagination of an architect with too much time on their hands? I'm always amazed at all the time that we seem to think that our architects have, that they can do so many projects at the same time. And then as if that's not enough, they can then devote their time to doing conceptual projects. And they just like to draw. And oddly enough, you do have art that's associated with architects. And yet at the same time, Art Deco is considered a thing of the past. And the justification will be because people wanted brutalist architecture, people wanted postmodern architecture, because it's a little bit more convenient. What are your thoughts looking at this intriguing structure with this large sphere and this cone and the size and the scale? And clearly these seem to be columns. What scale is this? Would this be achievable with today's technology? No, of course not. We'll be told that this is merely the wild imagination of some architects with too much time on their hands. That they could lay out buildings that were utterly gargantuan in size and didn't really make a lot of sense at that time, and they don't make any sense now. But the troubling aspect is we have seen many of the details of these structures. We've seen them in all of our explorations on the ground. So if the details exist, was this just someone putting it together with their imagination to make something that was just beyond the scope of reality? And why do I keep mentioning the fact that these were legitimate architects, at least that we're told that they were? Well, because they did actually design buildings. Indeed, there's a hotel in Paris that was designed by Boully. And yet at the same time, he was also conceptualizing these very impressive structures, these large spheres. It seems to me that this is indicative of a completely different architectural style that did not exist to the official account, and yet this is an indication of something that did exist. And what do we have here? Our favorite lions, because of course we always have our lions by our buildings. And then a compilation of works supposedly attributed to Boully. We've seen this one in the lower right. And in the upper right, we see what appears to be some very interesting power generation device. Now, of course, we'll be told that it's supposed to be some sort of observatory, some sort of planetarium, because it's a sphere, and we automatically associate sphere with round and globe, and etc., etc. And yet we're seeing more indications of architectural stylings. And indeed, imagine a world capital, or perhaps I should say a land capital of an entire civilization that would reach this size, where you have a pediment this extensive, lines of people walking up to the entryway, and numerous columns, along with a dome, flanked by many, many, many columns. What exactly is this telling us, and how large is this cupola at the top? And what are your thoughts on these images? And I'll close off by just saying the rather modest hotel that still stands to this day that's attributed to Boully. And yet, interestingly enough, it does still show old world construction, design, and detailing around this portal window, and then a very well designed column. But what other evidence do we have that would give us the indication that these designs attributed to these erratic and yet ingenious French architects were a little bit more than simply the product of their imaginations? If you scan our libraries and our own archives, what you'll find is no shortage of books that were supposedly composed by architects. Yes, they tell us that architects did these very painstakingly rendered sketches or drawings of the exterior and interiors of what we consider to be old world buildings. This particular one was published in the 1880s or so, we're told, although oftentimes I question that. And yet, what we'll see is the elaborate interior of many different structures, whether it's a cathedral, a church, a basilica, or whatever we've decided to call it now. And we'll see many of the same detailings that we've seen in our on site explorations, whether we were in state capitals or any other sort of building where we see the massive columns, we have the impressions within the ceiling. This looks to be like a massive oculus, and we have a pediment here. And then you can see the individuals in this drawing with this stairway to give you an idea for scale. What's intriguing is that these architects, again, seem to have all kinds of time to where they could go around and compose books that are well over 500 pages with all these wondrous sketches. Now, how much time was involved in doing these sketches? And the other question that would come down to is, why didn't they just do a picture documentation? Or perhaps this was a different way of doing that. And indeed, we can see many of the fine details and questionable symbols that we've come across in our old world explorations, throughout on site explorations and all across the land. Now, what is this really showing us? I am under the impression that once again, this is an archive. This is a record of surviving examples of structures and even alluding to technology that we're told that was done under the facade of an architect to preserve all this. Now, there's no doubt that it was to be preserved, but preserved in what fashion? And could this have been simply a massive catalog or a compendium of everything which had survived, the most dramatic examples, which those in power might feel could potentially cause questions that they didn't want asked? For example, in this particular sketch, again from the 1880s, we see stylings that we would associate with the Art Deco style, although we're told that Art Deco is very much a product of the 20th century. So this seems to be another anachronism, something that doesn't match what we're told in the timeline. Or maybe you're just going to say you're using your imagination, this isn't actually Art Deco styling. But what's really going on with all this detailing? And we can see that this particular architect decided to capture other things which we wouldn't traditionally associate with architecture, but more of an art affiliation with it. So was it really an architect drawing this, or was it someone else? Because again, we see signs of the technology that's been captured, and that seems to be the intent behind it. Now, if you go to a later portion of this same book, you will find that they also decide to detail what they call trophies or compilations of what appears to be coats of arms and urns and other decorations. Yes, once again, we see our favorite griffin depicted here on what appear to be urns. But are these urns? This kind of reminds me of that owl that we saw in that courthouse in Iowa. So, very intriguing when we see many of the replications of the symbols all over the place that show us different aspects of the previous civilization. Obviously, this seems to be something that was done as a great catalog, but the fact that we're told that this is merely an architect who is concerned with capturing certain portions of buildings, and yet they seemed more concerned with artwork. And indeed, you'll find that there is a catalog of statues in this compendium. What exactly does that have to do with architecture? Well, everything, because we need to put statues to make it into complete architecture, right? We've seen this particular object before, and we've speculated that maybe it has something to do with power generation or it reflects something of the previous civilization. And here it's just put in this nice little urn. And then we see other devices that have been very painstakingly cataloged, again in sketches, not with photographs. Now, why would someone go to all this trouble to make all these sketches? Obviously, all these things that we're looking at existed, or maybe it's not so obvious. But if it's not so obvious, then who had the time and inclination, especially in the 1800s, to compose something from their imagination? And now you see how it relates back to the works of Lequeux and Boly that we looked at earlier in this exploration. Why would somebody be devoting time, especially in that time frame that we're told, where people had no time? In fact, we're told that people worked long days, 7 days a week, and they walked uphill to school both ways. And yet we see other interesting symbols and aspects. For example, we've seen this particular symbol before. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the name of it is, I don't think I should have to. But let's just say we've seen this sort of geometry in many different explorations, whether it's a state capitol or just some random commercial building, or even that lovely plumber building in Rochester, Minnesota. It all comes up and it's all repeated in many different examples. And yet, once again, we see that they decide to capture some of the tombs. Now, why would they be so concerned about the tombs? And remember that in the earlier works, we saw this focus on tombs. Or are these tombs? Are these vaults that are, once again, remnants of a previous civilization, with their detailing captured on them? So many different details in so many different places, and let's consider the fact that somebody had to go through the trouble of building this. Somebody should have original sketches or schematics, and then we're to believe that an architect came around later and decided they were going to do sketches in a 500-page book. And so many books that you can't even count that were 500 pages or more that show all these fine-tuned examples. I'd almost think that there was some sort of old world explorer going around in the 1800s that was going around doing these kind of sketches to record this. Although I'm not under the impression that they had the same intention of exploration that we do. What this feels like is that these objects, these devices, these pieces of technology, or this architecture as we consider it, was simply being recorded and cataloged. Now, was that for redesignation? Was that for some sort of method of deciding what was going to remain and what was going to be removed, if they indeed had the means? Well, that's up for you to decide. Let me know what you think in the comments. But still, it's a lot of work and a lot of effort just to record all this, just to get the details that we see. And yet we see so many of the signs, so many of the symbols that we've actually seen in many of our on-site explorations over the past year. There's also a focus on statues. Now, I'm not going to repeat the point that what's an architect doing sketching statues and what's supposed to be a work that's documenting architecture. And we have all these questionable aspects with the statues. Is this really the Virgin holding the Savior, or is this depicting something else? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. We also have these urns or these fountains that are depicted, whatever purpose that we're given with them. And again, we see aspects of the same symbolism that we've come across in our other explorations. So very well documented. And yes, I am going to use that terminology because somebody did go through a lot of effort to sketch all of this and to catalog all this for inclusion within this book. And we're lucky that we're able to gaze on all these different aspects because we see not only detailed architecture, not only advanced construction, but also signs and hints of much more advanced technology that comes down in all these different, what do we want to call these? Altars, these trophies, these fountains, these wells. Yes, you need to have a very well-designed well. Get it? But then last but not least, the book concludes with some of the most advanced decorations that you'll see, and that's what we'll be told. These are just decorations on a window. It gives a whole new meaning to window dressing, doesn't it? Look at how this was achieved. Think about this. Was this really carved out? And yet this drawing even includes the actual individual bricks. And every single detail in terms of what was actually rendered here. And when you really look at this, you can actually see it. You just have to think of all the time that, again, went into the effort to originally construct this, whether this was sculpted, carved, even bigger laugh, or if this is some sort of advanced geopolymer that was formed through some technique that we don't fully understand and then poured in place. Or was it some sort of advanced 3D printing? Or was it some sort of combination of techniques that we can't even begin to imagine? These are the kind of ideas that we get when we look at these very impressive images. And we think about the different aspects of either modular construction, whether these were constructed in different pieces and then assembled. But then I also ask you to think about the individual who went through the trouble of cataloging and documenting all this with all these painstaking drawings and every single detail that they captured. Also pay attention to the symbols. You'll see everything that we've seen: lions, griffins, fasces, numerous columns, different other sorts of figures that indicate other things. This cartouche, this display device, whatever you want to call it. We have so many different names for it, but we've seen the same thing, and we've seen it all over the land. It doesn't matter where we are or what we're doing, we see the same symbols. And once again, this gives us that impression and that evidence that we did have a civilization that spanned the lands. The same civilization that reflected all of its grandeur and its architecture and its surviving technology. And when you look at all these books and all these renderings, and there's thousands upon thousands of drawings just like this that show this kind of detailing. This is just window dressing. And yet somebody had the time, the effort, and the inclination to do this, to decorate a window in this manner. And we've seen this all over the realm. We've seen this all over the land. All these figures and all the effort that went into imposing this just on a window. And somebody decided to take the effort to draw it after this was done. So what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. Are we really to believe that the people of the medieval time frame and then the Renaissance and then the 16 to the 1800s had all that time, all that effort, all those resources that they decided to build all these buildings and then put this kind of detailing into it? That they even continued this up until the early 1900s, according to our official account, and then they just decided to stop it because then World War II happened. And after World War II, no one seemed interested in projecting artwork in their structures anymore. We went to brutalist and then postmodern, where everything was supposedly functional, cost-effective, and economically viable. And yet the same thing supposedly applied in the past, and yet for whatever reason, we're to believe that the previous civilizations that were told in our official history that preceded us, and some of them that still exist to this day, had the time, the inclination, and the logistical capacity to achieve these wondrous works of art in their simple window dressings. So yes, I don't think I'll ever hear window dressing with the same term again. But in conclusion, what we're really seeing is that this work of art is something that we just don't really do anymore. And we're supposed to believe it's because we lack the inclination. It's not because we lack the capability. Or some will argue that we lack the capability because people have changed and everyone's just gotten lazy and people don't work as hard as they used to. And if you just work hard, then you can achieve logistical impossibilities because you didn't need heavy machinery. You didn't need the ability to haul construction materials over many miles or hundreds of miles with a limited logistical capacity to even establish the building blocks for many of these structures that still stand to this day. And my final closing point is that this seems to show us true evidence that there was an effort made to record all the remnants of the old world. And you can find it with the detailings of these structures, many of which still stand to this day, showing their exterior and the interiors. And then when you consider the works of what we're told are attributed to extravagant and exotic French architects who just had too much time on their hands, it suddenly brings an entirely different perception towards their works. Perhaps what they were really doing is they were really recording the structures that did remain, or had somehow survived the reset before they were brought down and repurposed, or the building materials salvaged for use in other buildings. But what are your thoughts? I'll include the link to this particular book in the description of the video. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.